Hi, welcome to the 30th Annual Symposium on the Holocaust and Genocide. I'm Marlene Grossman. I coordinate the symposium along with Naomi Kramer from the Holocaust Education and Genocide Prevention Foundation. Welcome to our lecture with TerryGlavin. He is an author, journalist, Ottawa citizen, and National Post columnist, contributing editor for Maclean's Magazine. He's a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. He's an author of several books, including Come from the Shadows, The Long and Lonely Struggle for Peace in Afghanistan, and recipient of several literary and journalism awards. Recent assignments include Afghanistan, Israel, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Geneva, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Please welcome TerryGlavin.
I was asked to talk about Afghanistan and the origins of talibanism, and I'm going to tell a story about that. It begins a while back, and it's a way I've come to understand as a useful way of telling the story. But right off the top, I want to mention that there was a term that people in the Warsaw Pact countries, the Eastern Bloc, used to use when they were reading the official press about Central Asia, about Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, the conquests of the Stalinist empire. And they referred to it as Absurdistan because they knew they couldn't believe what they were reading in the papers. And there is a similarity. You know, obviously there's a difference between flourishing and fractious and weird news media in the Anglosphere and what you would find in the Warsaw Pact countries. But there is a kind of an Absurdistan that you will find yourself reading about when you read about Afghanistan. Sometimes the reasons for that are very, very simple. There's just not enough journalists to go around anymore. When Canadian soldiers were sent to Afghanistan, we were sent down to the worst bit of bandit country between the Mediterranean Sea and New Delhi. Really nasty patch of ground around Kandahar. And that was trying to, it would be like trying to figure out what America was like if the only dispatches that you were getting were from the back seat of a police cruiser in Detroit in the middle of the night. So there's all kinds of reasons why I think we have tended to get the story wrong. I think actually racism has something to do with it. But we have tended to get the story so wrong that it comes as a shock when people learn that in fact, most Afghans are perfectly content with the idea of women voting, women working outside the home, that the overwhelming majority of Afghans would very much like to have a sovereign and democratic, Islamic-inflected republic, that the overwhelming majority of Afghans throughout the period of the United Nations, NATO, ISAF mission in the country, we tend to think of that as an American thing. Certainly the Americans were the biggest player, but it was an international mission, and it was, I think, 53 countries had soldiers in Afghanistan at its height. And the overwhelming majority of Afghans were quite supportive of the intervention. It was a funny thing used to happen, you go from Toronto or New York or London to Afghanistan, and you find that when you leave home, you're talking to people about the war in Afghanistan, and you get to Afghanistan, you find that when people there talk about the war in Afghanistan, they're talking about things that were happening before 9/11. Talibanism itself is in fact not an Afghan phenomenon. It's not, it's foreign to certainly most of Afghanistan. It is a pathology within a certain branch of the Pashtun tribes. The Pashtuns are a great people. I don't want to leave people with the wrong impression when I talk about this. Back in the 1930s, 1940s, for instance, during the struggle for freedom in the Indian subcontinent, Abdul Ghaffar Khan who was Pashtun pacifist, was a contemporary of Gandhi's, and so on. Some of the greatest poets and intellects in Afghan history have been Pashtun. But Talibanism is essentially a kind of a Pashtun sociopathology, in the same way that Nazism was a distinctly German sociopathology, but part of a broader kind of fascism. The other thing is that it's uncontroversial in the north of Afghanistan, particularly, to understand Talibanism as a kind of a recrudescence of something that they had become extremely and painfully familiar with in the 1920s and the 1930s. At that time, the Third Reich was the deepest influence in Afghanistan, the largest legation in Kabul, and the genocidal suffering that was endured by the minorities of Afghanistan during that period was the echo that people heard when the Taliban emerged out of the Pakistani side of the Durand line in the late 1980s to the late 1990s. And that's something too that comes as a shock to a lot of people. The influence of of European fascism, particularly Nazism, in the so-called Muslim world at that period, is I think a useful way of understanding. Certainly is the way a lot of Afghan intellectuals understand Talibanism. So I will begin that story from the beginning. And I like to do it this way, and it kind of scares people a little bit, because I'm going to begin with Cain and Abel. And that sounds like a long time ago. Oh God, he's going to be banging on all day. Exactly. Marlene's looking at her watch already. But I'll start there because Cain slew Abel. And that much the Quran and the Bible and the Torah agree upon. In the Quran, those first sons of Adam and Eve are called Qabil and Habil, and Qabil wandered eastwards from Eden into the land of Nod with a mark of some kind on him, a curse, and his lineage came to nothing. So it fell to his younger brother Seth, who's known in the Islamic tradition as Sheeth, to be the settler and the farmer and the builder, and he ended up having psalms bestowed upon him by Allah, and Adam had taught him the hours of prayer and bequeathed to him the duties of prophethood and burdened him with the knowledge of the great flood that was to come. And it is from Sheeth ibn Adam that all humankind today is said to descend. And I visited the guy's grave, at least the place where a lot of people in Central Asia consider to be his burial site. And that burial site is in a sleepy little village east of the grand city of Mazar-e Sharif, and it's called Balkh. It's a very, very, very peculiar place. It's kind of it's a necropolis, it's a tumulus, it's a little farming village, and they grow pomegranates, and there's a lot of disturbed earth and a lot of what appear to be ruins. And there's a lot of interesting conversation among the people of the village about what it is the ruins represent and which periods of history they're talking about. UNESCO has been dying to get in there, do a proper job of it. But it was once known as, when the Arabs first arrived, when Islam first arrived, it came to be called the mother of all cities. It was here in Balkh in 1370 that Tamerlane crowned himself before setting off as the sword of Islam to slaughter and conquer from the Tigris to the Volga. It was in Balkh that Aurangzeb, the conqueror of the world, first held court. Frederick Starr is at Johns Hopkins University. He's one of a handful of historians and archaeologists that have managed to spend any time there. and describes Balkh back in the day as having been larger than Paris, Rome, or Beijing, or Delhi. And it had majestic palaces and public baths. In the older Persian epics, the first man was not Adam, but was Kayumars. And Kayumars built his kingdom at Bhakti, which is the name for Balkh in the hymns of Zarathustra. And Zarathustra is sort of like the Zoroastrian Moses. First preached his revelations there in Balkh. And some people say he died there about 2,700 years ago. And then during the reign of the Kushan kings about 2,000 years ago, Balkh was second only to Rajagriha in Buddhism as the most holy place on earth. And monks from as far away as Sri Lanka would travel to make their pilgrimages to Balkh. It was also the capital, or the Vatican, of the Nestorian Church. They're an interesting bunch, the Nestorians. They kind of missed out on the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. And then they'd kind of gone their own way. And then I guess it was the Council of Ephesus in 431, I think it was, that they were declared to be heretics. But the Nestorians were the Christians who went to China and actually did very well for themselves, established monasteries and churches all over China during the, I guess it was the Tang Dynasty. Long before the European Enlightenment, there was this guy named Rumi AlBalki, also known as Hiwi the Heretic. He was a Jewish guy. And he, I'm told, and I've read, was the first person to use Hebrew in the construction of sort of atheist and secularist polemics, and composed more than 200 rationalist objections to the miracles of Hebrew scripture. Came from Balkh. And he was quite controversial among Jewish scholars from Babylon to Andalusia. He was also a poet. Balkh is renowned for its poets. The Jewish quarter of Balkh persisted for 1,000 years. And all we really know about the Jews of Balkh is that they wore canonical hats and they liked to sing and drink wine. And they were outwardly much like everybody else, and they were gone by the 1930s for reasons that I will come to. Jehodenak was the name of the Jewish district of Balkh, the town of the Jews. Century after he was a fellow by the name of Ibn Sina, the prince of physicians, often described as the father of modern medicine, known to medieval Europe as Avicenna, and is still known among Roman Catholic historians as a foundational influence on the bedrock theology and the theologian Thomas Aquinas in Catholicism. A century after Ibn Sina, the city was teeming with about 200,000 people. The poet Omar Khayyam was a schoolboy there. His classic Rubaiyat was unknown to the English-speaking world until the 1800s. It was a city of Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians. And it's, even in its sort of currently blighted form, Afghanistan is home to about 30, half a dozen major linguistic groups and ethnic groups, and about 30 languages, all told. And Afghanistan is sort of what remains of the Durrani Empire from the 18th century. I should also mention that in Balkh, while it was, there's very little that remains of the Buddhist city Nava Vihara. And there's a reason why so much of this is confused, and there's so much tumuli and dispute about what period each mound of earth should be attributed to. The 13th century Sufi mystic and poet known to the English-speaking world as Rumi was from Balkh, Rumi AlBalki. I think he's sort of generally accepted to be the greatest poet in all of Islam. And the school he first attended was in Balkh, and I visited it. There's not much left of it, but it's still there. And so why is it that we don't know anything about Balkh? And we never hear anything about Balkh. You know, so it was the capital of the kingdom of 1,000 cities, the Bactrian Empire, you know, Alexander the Great, all that stuff. Is a lot of it's got to do with what happened in the 1920s and 1930s, the Great Obliteration. If you go to Balkh today, as I say, it's like a little rural village. And the shrine of Ali Nasser is in the middle of it. It's quite glorious. And there's other little wonderful things that haven't been wrecked. But there are these kind of roads that appear to have been dug into the ground that radiate outwards from that shrine. And they're kind of concentric rings that connect the roads in places. And that happened because of what occurred in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it's why so many people in the north of Afghanistan understand the talibanism as something that was a lash that was put to people's backs, that was the same lash that was put to people's backs in the 1920s and the 1930s, except back in the day, it was the Third Reich that was funding it and manipulating everything and organizing it, not rather than the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. And the reason for that is that the German master race theorists had identified Balkh as the birthplace of the cradle of Aryanism. The race of the Afghans, they invented this idea of the race of the Afghans as being the cradle where our nation was nurtured, and even more of the Aryan race. And so what the Nazis wanted to do is they wanted to build a city on top of everything that kind of obliterated all of the interesting cultural remnants and religious traditions that conflicted with the way Pashtun supremacists understood the history of Balkh. And so this is where all of the worst purges and pogroms began in the early 1930s there. It was one of the first things that the king did. It was actually his interior minister, Muhammad Gul Khan Mamand. There was an edict that all of the Jews of Balkh be scattered to the four corners of the earth. There's a great writer, an adventurist at the time, Robert Byron, who happened to be traveling towards Balkh in 1934. And he did not really know it at the time. He couldn't understand there were these processions of people that were flowing in the direction of Herat from Balkh. And it was only later when he got to Balkh and had lunch with the governor that he understood that those were the Jews who had been there for so many centuries. And they were being expunged from Balkh. So that ring road work, that's where that comes from, those strange radiating roads. What Momand was known to British intelligence as in the 1930s was a fanatic sort of devotee of something called Pashtunization, which is the imposition of the Pashto language in all government transactions the erasure of non-Pashtun cultural influences from the affairs of state, the marginalization of non-Pashtun Afghans, which is the majority of Afghans, by the way, Uzbeks, Turkmen, Hazaras, Jews, IMAX, and so on. He came to be known as the second Genghis Khan. The last significant changes in the fortunes of the city were tied to that uprooting, the uprooting of the indigenous inhabitants, and the influx of a Pashto-speaking population. And so Moman took these steps to ensure that the existing monuments, I'm reading now from a Tajik history, and grave markers provided no reminder that anyone other than Pashtuns had ever lived in the city. There's another fellow, Robert McChesney, I should say, from New York University, who's done some work here. And everything had to sort of accord with the revisionism that Momand had kind of invented in service of the Reich. In those years, the idea of a superior Aryan race was growing out of the anti-Semitism at the heart of the National Socialist movement in post-war Germany. And because of it, German diplomats and scholars had come to see a kinship between themselves and the Afghans as Aryans. Promoting Aryanism literally took a more concrete form in the decision to build a new Balk. And so anyway, I can bang on about this all day. It really is a fascinating story because it involves so many civilizations and so many cultural traditions. It's such a magnificent history that's sort of on this fulcrum of this one little village in northern Afghanistan. But this is actually important for, I think, our purposes here today. We have to understand Talibanism as fundamentally genocidal. And we really do have to get our heads around a little bit of the origin of it. It wasn't, there is a religious or theocratically or theologically, Taliban, the idea of Islam as articulated by Mullah Omar and the other Taliban mullahs is kind of a perversion of Deobandist Islam. And I almost sort of hesitate to even use the word Islam because it's such a slander to our Muslim sisters and brothers. But we're kind of stuck with it in a way, as long as we understand what we're talking about here. And also something that has to be understood is the influence of the Reich in the Muslim world. I don't even like using that term because it sounds like a different planet where the laws of gravity operate differently, and actually they don't. But that's something to keep your eye on is, and I think the work of Jeffrey Herf is really, really good. He's Brandeis University. The echoes of European anti-Semitism in the dialectics and the rhetoric of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Khomeinists of Iran took on that distinctly, although it was always there, but it did take on a distinctly kind of European fascist inflection that persists today. And the influence was such that in Iran, or in the Persian universe at the time, which of course took in most of Afghanistan and does take in most of Afghanistan now, it was not uncommon for it to be publicly speculated that Adolf Hitler might be the hidden imam, the 12th imam, that he had come to rid the world of the Jews. And there is still in Afghanistan a kind of a crypto-fascist party, Afghan Millet, very influential during the period of Hamid Karzai, after 9/11, at the beginning of the attempted democratic project in Afghanistan. The Afghan Millet Their founders were all educated in the universities in Germany and Berlin during the period of the Reich. Baathism is quite similar to that, and there is some, well, for instance, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which is part of Bashar Assad's ruling coalition in Damascus, has its own stylized swastika, its own shiny boots, fancy uniforms, imagines the Levant cleansed of its Jews, has a song, an anthem sung to the tune of Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. I mean, you know, all they're missing is a little mustache, right? That's where that comes from, obviously. And you'll see a lot of that in Islamist and in fascistic Arab and Muslim tendencies. I really want to insist, though, that those are not Afghan tendencies. I'm a bit of a public opinion poll nerd. And for a while there, the Afghan people were like the most studied people of Central Asia. They'd been studied more closely than any other people of Central Asia had ever been studied. After 9/11, it was mainly the Asia Foundation in the United States that produced all of this work, and they did all kinds of interesting sort of regional, local surveys, attitude surveys, focus groups, and so on. And not once did support for the Taliban ever reach double digits. If you wanted to get up to double digits, like 11 or 12%, you had to throw in things like anti-government organizations. Do you have any sympathy for anti-government organizations, armed anti-government organizations? And I mean, when I think about some of the imbecilities of the, I hate to be uncharitable, but the American effort in the South, I could actually see myself kind of ticking the box. Yeah, I kind of got some sympathy for that guy over in the other valley who's been ripped off by, you know, his competitor in this valley and gets all the roads and the infrastructures, and he's decided to take up arms against the coalition forces. But yeah, that's something that people should really understand, is that one of the things that used to drive me crazy during the period of Canada's most intense engagement was you would hear it was the language that, you know, you would think perfectly intelligent people were using to describe their objections to the military engagement in Afghanistan. And one of the things one would hear is, well, we're trying to impose our values on them at the barrel of a gun. And every time I hear that, I just think to myself, wait a minute, who's saying this and what kind of values do they have exactly? And am I really supposed to believe that the women of Afghanistan are enduring such sacrifice and struggle to be able to go to school and to university because of something Donald Rumsfeld said? Actually, this is something that Afghan people would prefer. They would prefer a democratic life, and they would prefer a peaceful life. They're quite devout, you know. They're not crazy in their religious views, but they are nothing like the image, I think, that a lot of the media has inadvertently painted of them. So one of the things that was interesting about how before 9/11, when the Taliban really kind of burned itself into the Western imagination, was, I mean, there was tremendous work that the women's movement did, getting imagery and footage out of Afghanistan about the way women had become slaves, that were literally enslaved by the Taliban regime. But it was the destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan. I don't know if people recall that, these remarkable, sort of one of the wonders of the world, the Unesco heritage site, these great Buddhas carved into a mountainside in Hazarajat in the Bamiyan Valley that were destroyed by the Taliban, blown up. And, you know, I think it was interesting how we kind of got that story wrong. It wasn't so much that they were Buddhist. This was Buddhist iconography. It was a couple of things. The first is that it represented the human form, but it was the face, it was the eyes that really bothered them. And it was because the eyes were Hazara eyes. And if you look closely at the footage of those Buddhas as they were being blown up, you might notice that there are cannon holes in the Buddhas as well from back in the day, back in the time of the Emir Rahman Khan. And it's because they're Hazaras. And the Hazara people they're about a fifth of the population of Afghanistan. And they are, on the subject of genocide, have been subjected to the most brutal and ruthless genocides in Afghan history. Under the Emir in the 19th century, about 60% of the population of the Hazaras was liquidated. And they were also sold into slavery in Kandahar. And they continue to be subjected to pogrom and massacre to this day. And it was the Emir, Abdur Rahman Khan, who started this, you might say. And over the decades, they have continued to face this oppression and violence and cruelty. One of the interesting things about the Hazaras, there's a great little place. It's not a little place. It's a population nobody knows, about 300,000. It looks like something out of the 12th century, but it's basically 15, 20 years old. It's Dasti Barshi, a district of Afghanistan that kind of goes up the mountainside. That's where the Hazaras live. Almost all of the Hazaras in Kabul live there. And, it's a fascinating place because it really does, everything's sort of built of clay. It's really old. But, there's telephone wires and there's goats wandering in the streets and everybody's got a little garden patch. The Hazaras are the poorest people in Afghanistan. They're the people who come down from the mountain and they do your washing for you and they clean the streets, and they come in at night and they clean everybody's offices. They take out the latrines. They're also the best educated people in Afghanistan. They're really devout in terms of the devotion to education is really something that means a lot to them. I remember one of my more interesting experiences with the Hazara people was in a place called Marafat High School in Dasti Barchi. It was a co-educational institution. And they had been physically attacked by mobs more than once. And curiously, these were not Sunni, sort of Talib type mobs that were actually incited by the Khomeinist mosque, which has tried to insinuate Khomeinists have tried to insinuate themselves as the kind of protectors of the Shia minorities in the Sunni majority country of Afghanistan. But at Marafat High School, there were pictures on the wall of the people that the kids had been studying, and it was Spinoza and Abraham Lincoln and Gandhi. And they were an amazing group of kids. They were really, really bright and really, really curious about the outside world, very skeptical about claims that their own government was making, that the NATO forces was making. But why can't you catch Al-Qaeda? Why can't you catch the leaders of the Taliban? You can see things from outer space, for goodness sake. So they have suffered a tremendous amount. I don't know if people will recall almost 2 years ago to the day, that horrific attack on a maternity ward in Kabul,
It was in Dashti Barchi. And Médecins Sans Frontières was running it. 24 people were killed. 16 mothers and 2 children. Last year, 85 people, most of them girls between the ages of 11 and 17, were killed in bombings outside the Syed ul Shahada High School in Dashti Barchi. 9 Hazara men were massacred by the Taliban when its fighters took over Ghazni in July. 2,000 Hazaras were driven out of Ghazni in August of 2021. 13 Hazaras were slaughtered in Daikundi. Dozens killed in last October after the Taliban were invited to come back in by the Americans in that unpardonable action, and everybody involved is going to go to hell when they die. Betraying the democratic Afghan project to the Taliban and to the Pakistani ISI. Dozens of people were killed in a suicide bombing in Kunduz. Most of them, of course, it was at a mosque, and most of them were Hazara. And then also last October, 47 people killed, 70 others wounded in a mostly Hazara mosque in Kandahar. I'm going to wrap this up because it gets a bit dreary when I talk about it. I get angry, and I got to watch that. I get angry because it's personal, and because it's about, friends of mine and people I care about. And we might want to talk about what happened last August, when the Americans decided, this wonderful liberal Uncle Joe Biden decided to do what Donald Trump, in one of his worst moments, decided he would do. The last time Donald Trump was thinking the last time Joe Biden, the Americans, were thinking along these lines of just pulling the pin and walking away was 10 years ago. And that was when, at the time, Barack Obama had decided to leave Joe Biden the responsibility of deciding what to do in Afghanistan. Nobody in Afghanistan could understand what the hell was going on, because Obama was elected specifically, well, this is the good war. We're going to put our shoulders to the wheel. When he was elected president, I was in Gandhama, I was in Kabul, and you have absolutely no idea the rejoicing in the streets and how happy everybody was that finally we got an American president who's going to take this seriously. And then Biden comes along and says, well, I think we should just walk. And nobody could quite figure, is this possible? A friend of mine, Faum Dashti, who was the editor of Kabul Weekly, lovely man, very interesting fellow. He was actually in the Panjshir Valley with Ahmed Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, the week before 9/11, when Massoud was assassinated. He was assassinated by an Al-Qaeda suicide bombers posing as journalists, and that great gift to Mullah Omar allowed Mullah Omar to say to Osama bin Laden, okay, you've done this great favor to me, you can now do what you need to do in New York. And Fahim was with Massoud at the time. Beautiful man, but his arms were, and much of his upper torso was sort of like the bark of a tree, because he was there when he was very, very, very badly injured when Massoud was killed. And he was the editor of Kabul Weekly, and we were trying to sort this stuff out. We were doing all of these sort of focus group kind of work, interviewing Afghan intellectuals and journalists about what kind of, was there any possibility of a reconciliation with the Talibs? What would that look like? Because that's what the Americans were saying, do a deal with them, do a deal with them. And Fahim would say to me, at the end of the day, if this happens, I'm going back up into the mountains. Everybody was saying that, by the way, but particularly Faum. He says, I couldn't do it. I'll go back into the mountains. And so last August, he went back into the mountains. And I spoke to him on a Thursday night, was the last I spoke with him, and on Sunday night, he was dead. So I do get a little cranky. I hope you'll forgive me when I talk about these things. But that's kind of a little brief history of genocide and Afghanistan. And I'll leave it to questions from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to open up questions. Yes, feel free to clap. Yes. So does anybody else in the audience have any questions? Sorry, I'm just walking over to the person for the question.
So the Afghan people have been very friendly to Indian culture for a long, long time. They watch Indian movies, even though they don't necessarily speak our languages. But I've always thought of the Taliban in recent years as being an ISI creation. They're funded by the ISI, and the ISI wants to make sure the Afghan people are no longer friendly with the Indian people, which is not going to happen. But is there some reason the Americans don't understand this?
I should really have talked about that more. I was doing a bit more broad stroke, but yes, specifically, very specifically, the thing that we call the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which has ended up being called the Taliban, was created by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. Interestingly, for the specific purpose of getting rid of a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's in the warlord years. I didn't really get into this very much at all. After the Soviets were chased out, there was actually a very stable government in Afghanistan for about 3.5 years. Najibullah ran it. They ran out of oil and gas because the Russians just stopped shipping oil and gas to the country. And there was a period of terrible, terrible internecine kind of warfare that tragically broke down largely along ethnic lines. And Hekmatyar was the best funded. There were 14 different, Mujahideen organizations. And everyone says, oh, the Americans created Al-Qaeda. It's rubbish. The Americans never funded Al-Qaeda. That was an Arab grouping. 7 of the groupings were funded by Iran. The rest were funded by the United States and by China and the Americans, and organized by the Pakistani ISI on that side, the 7 on that side. And they decided that this Hekmatyar guy he's too hard to control. So we need to have our own show in Afghanistan that we can more directly control. And so we're going to give Mullah Omar everything he needs, and he's going to move in and he's going to take over Afghanistan. The only governments in the world that ever recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan were Pakistan, I believe the Qataris briefly, United Arab Emirates, and the Saudis. And by the time of 9/11, only Pakistan supported and recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. The legitimate government of Afghanistan was the government that was represented at the United Nations. And that was headed up by Burhanuddin Rabbani. Very interesting man. I spent some time with him after 9/11. He was appointed the head of the Peace Council. It was his job to try to negotiate a peace settlement with the Taliban. He was assassinated by the Taliban. But yes, there is a very interesting thing. Music, I think, has a lot to do with it. Afghan music is very, very much part of that northern Indian tradition. And they're crazy about Bollywood. They're just mental about Bollywood. There's a lot of affection among the Afghan people for India. And India has been very, very good. And it's been a difficult thing to do because of Pakistan. and all that. But India's actually been very good in assisting Afghans in the development of infrastructure and funding education and so on.
Thank you. A Zoom question. Why have we abandoned the Afghan refugees but have taken on Ukraine in huge numbers?
Have we taken on the Ukrainians? Did I miss something? I don't know, I think we have to make a very clear distinction between what Canadians want and what our government does. And I think that's true everywhere. I've heard very nasty things said, but oh gosh, we seem to be so sad about the Ukrainians, but we sure didn't care about the Syrians. That's actually not true. We really did care about the Syrians. My God, Canadians very much cared about Syrians. After that little boy on the beach, Alan Kurdi, I actually broke that story. So I won't be having people lecture me and tell me the Canadians didn't care. We sure did. In fact, the last I looked, the Group of 5 application system for Syrian refugees, there was still a backlog. We're still waiting. But there is, I think, a case to be made that, the way we write about and talk about Afghanistan, it's a difficult problem because you're up against, Afghanistan wants to build a sovereign and democratic republic, and it's surrounded by, on one side, Pakistan, which is the most, hostile and sinister player in the whole region, except for perhaps close contest, Iran, which is on the other side of Afghanistan. And so I think a lot of people were just, oh gosh, it's too complicated. We don't understand it, and then, all of the cliches and the nonsense come into it. In the case of Ukraine, I don't think anybody should feel any guilt or shame or embarrassment at all about, wanting to find Mr. Putin and set him on fire. Yeah, we care about Ukraine. We care about the Ukrainian people, and we care about what we're seeing there, which is a replication of what we saw in Syria, by the way, tactically and strategically. Same people. Nemetsov, I think his name is the general who is bombing the living daylights of Mariupol, was the guy who destroyed Aleppo. So I don't know. I don't know. I guess there is, I think, I hate this, but what the hell? A kind of a war weariness that people were feeling about Afghanistan, even though there really wasn't a war going on there the last 2.5 years that affected any, Americans or British people. Canada was out of there. The Dutch were still there, Germans. But there is a sense that, ooh, it's just too complicated, And that's really tragic because what was happening is that there was a new generation of Afghans just coming up. Think about it, 20 years after 9/11, right? They were just graduating from high school and university. They were just coming into their own. And people forget that this really is these are generational projects, all right? You don't take a country like Afghanistan, reduce a third of them to refugees wandering the roads of the earth, a third of them to penury and slavery, and a third of them on the brink of famine. After 1.5 million of them were killed in a so-called civil war, and then just say, oh, okay, you can get back on your feet now. It takes a lot of work, and I think there's a lot of the problem with the West, another term I don't particularly like, the liberal democracies, is that we take so much for granted and we don't understand that these things take a long time. That democracy is a muscle that can't be allowed to be atrophied, and that you cannot turn an entire nation of people into sort of the walking dead, people with serious mental health issues, shell-shocked, and then expect everything to be okay. That's, I think, something that we're going to have to think about very seriously when it comes to Ukraine. This is going to last for a long, long, long time. Putting this thing back together again. Inshallah, it can be put back together again.
Are there any questions from the audience? If not, I'm going to go to the Zoom question. The one before, David? Okay. Wow, how to know what to ask, they said. There's so much information. Can you recommend a book to read the history?
Oh, yeah, it's a good book. It's called Come from the Shadows, The Long and Lonely Struggle for Peace in Afghanistan. I wrote that book. I really wish I could say, well, I mean, if you're really into it, there's a lot of sort of deep history. Steve Cole, I think, the New Yorker. I think he's at Columbia University now. I think his best book was Ghost Wars. COLL. I highly recommend Steve. There've been a few others. I don't know. It's unfortunate. I wish I could say there were some really great books about Afghanistan. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next Zoom question. Could you speak about Harjeet Sajjan? Was he helpful? Was he a helpful person during the Afghanistan war?
Who?
Screen.
I don't see anybody's name there. Oh, Harjeet Sajjan. That's a saucy question. People don't know who Harjeet Sajjan is. Was our defense minister. What is he now? I don't know. He's been moved. I think Harjeet got himself into a lot of trouble because he claimed to have been, I think the word was architect of the counterinsurgency that the Canadians were involved with. And that, I think maybe he should spend more time on a job site, because architect is not exactly what he was doing. You could call him, I don't know, the lead contractor. But I don't know, I think Harjeet was pretty good. I mean, you know, I'm not a partisan person and I give the liberals a hard time all the time. I really, really give the liberals a hard time. But that's because they're the government. It's been in all the papers, man. They've been in the government for, you know, since late 2015. But yeah, he was a good soldier, and I shudder to say anything too uncharitable about him because my mom really likes him. So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions on Zoom? Oh, we have one in person. I'm just going to run out.
Do you have, are you sure, like, do you know the future of the Afghanistan people after they've been abandoned?
Yeah, what happens now? The struggle continues. People may be aware that the promise that the Talibs made that girls would be allowed to go to school. Of course, they broke that promise. And there's a lot of backstairs work and intrigue about whether or not this is really just the Taliban trying to persuade the IMF to release $600 million that's being held, that is due the legitimate government of Afghanistan, which the Taliban is not, and they never will be. They don't, by the way, there's no such thing as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. It's a fiction. So it's this weird netherworld where to recognize that they don't believe in government. They don't believe in government. It's complicated, but we're being, the Western world particularly, sort of being asked to sort of bygones, forget about it, just recognize us as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, and then maybe we'll let women go to school. Of course, you know, half the population is being held hostage, in other words. The future will depend a lot, believe it or not, I think, on what happens in Ukraine. What I've been doing, and it took me a while to realize, kind of figure it out. Sometimes you have to step back several paces from what you're covering as a journalist before you can actually see the thing. And I want to go back 15, 16, 17 years. If you look at the data from organizations like Freedom House, that venerable institution in the United States, you can see a clear trajectory over the last 16 years of democracy's decline worldwide and the rise of the police state bloc, a kind of an axis of Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Caracas, Rangoon, Seoul, or it's not Seoul, Pyongyang, and all these sort of little satellite states. The rise of the police state bloc, the takeover of the United Nations by the police state bloc, and the rout and retreat of democracies. That story is unfolding. We've reached one of the most important chapters in that story. Probably the most important chapter of that story is unfolding right now in the streets of Kyiv and Mariupol. And we got to win this one. The blood oaths that Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign ministry of Russia, have sworn to one another, the commitments that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have made to one another, most recently in a 5,300-word manifesto, was released when Putin went to the Beijing Olympics. We have to start believing what they say, what they're telling us. They mean business. They mean this. And the most recent meeting between Wang Yi and Lavrov in China was about divvying up the spoils in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has an astonishing reservoir of rare earth metals, minerals, copper, my gosh. So the future of Afghanistan, I think, will be bound up in this great epochal struggle between liberal democracy and the axis of sort of gangland Stalinism in Moscow, this state capitalist Leninism in Beijing, this twisted theocracy in Tehran, and the rest of us. And I think we really do need to stiffen our spines in that struggle, at least recognize that it's going on, for God's sake. And I think the future of Afghanistan will be determined by how that plays out.
Thank you. We have two follow-up questions. One follow-up question was by the person asking about Ukraine. So he said, what I meant was that we opened our doors so freely to asylum seekers from Ukraine and made it so difficult for Afghans.
Yeah, well, again, I'd say how easy have we made it for Ukrainians? I'm not sure that we have. How the hell do you get to Canada if you're in Lviv? But I think I get the point. Part of it is that we're not recognizing Ukrainians as refugees. There's a special immigration program that says, okay, come on over. You can hang out for as long as you need, and then you're going to be going back. You remember I was saying earlier about public opinion polls, and I'm kind of an anorak about these things. Afghans as recently as 2016, no, I think it was 2012, were among the most optimistic people in the world. Everything's great. Yeah, I'm glad to be alive. Happy to be an Afghan. Woohoo. And last year, the poll, it was actually last August, September, it was Gallup who did this poll. 53% of Afghans want to get the hell out of there. They want to leave. there's a whole bunch of complicated and disgraceful and embarrassing and stupid reasons why Canada was incapable of even getting its own interpreters out of Afghanistan, long before this fell apart in August. There was, you know, the friends of those interpreters, the military families, I mean, I'm talking years, could not get Ottawa to move. I found myself in I was in a funk last summer when this was happening. I was fit to be tied. And part of the difficulty I found as a journalist was that the best stories, the most important stories, I could not tell because I would compromise people who were involved. And by the time I could tell them, nobody would care anymore. And it was bad. It was bad. It was bad. I mean, I had senior people who aren't even supposed to be talking to me frankly and candidly, almost weeping on the phone out of Ottawa. It was so chaotic, so crazy and stupid. There was the mother of a cabinet minister who had cousins in Afghanistan, phoning a small women's NGO for help in getting them out. All the heavy lifting was done by NGOs. All of the heavy lifting was done by NGOs. The few journalists that I contributed to their escape in my own small way, it was seat of the pants stuff. Ottawa was useless, absolutely, and it was like it didn't even exist. The immigration department did not exist, didn't even exist. And if you sort of conducted yourself as though it did not exist, you had a fairly good chance of sneaking people through Mazar actually into Islamabad, and then they go into hiding, and then they wait for a number, a file number eventually that they can refer to when they go to the Canadian embassy in Islamabad. I just, it's enough to make you want to put pins in your eyes. It's actually a lot easier, although it's, I don't know why we haven't been sending aircraft to Poland to pick up Ukrainians and to just bring them over here, I mean, they're settled here. There's so many Ukrainians in Canada. Most of the Afghans in Canada, certainly the people I know, they work at 7-Eleven. And some of them are university professors. But the Ukrainians are really on their feet. So I think, does that answer this person's question, or is there a point that I was?
We'll find out. Let's go to the next one. So the second follow-up question was about Harjeet Sajjan. So he wrote, I understood that he knew all the languages and cultures there. I'm not sure what he wanted to ask. But...
Well, it sounds like somebody's inviting me to say something mean about Harjeet Sajjan. I could. It doesn't really matter.
Right. Okay. Does anybody from the audience have any questions?
Besides, there's my mom, like I said.
Yes, first of all, thank you for this history about German fascism and the influence in Afghanistan. It's the very first time I've heard this. And I actually thought I knew something about the German fascism. But
yeah, a lot of people, it comes as a surprise.
Yeah, very surprised about this. The other thing I wanted to ask, and I think it's a really naive question, but so you're saying support for the Taliban is not even in the double digits in Afghanistan.
No.
So how do they manage to have this stranglehold over Afghanistan if their support is so low?
Good question. Okay, there's a couple of ways of answering that. I think the easiest way to answer it is this. You give me a lot of ketamine. You know what ketamine is? It's really, really good dope.
Is it like that?
No, it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like meth or something. I don't know. Give me 400 or 500 guys, okay? And they're nuts, okay? And they believe that if they die, they go to heaven, whatever. I could take over Toronto in 24 hours, okay? I could take over Montreal in 2 days. Canadians would, I don't know what to do. Are you kidding me? That's all you need. And if you're supported by the military-industrial complex in Islamabad, you'll do well. You'll do well. And people, I think, just got worn down. There are a lot of people who ended up supporting the Taliban in this Pashtun areas because there was at least some stability. I think a lot that question is often asked in a slightly different way. I mean, what Joe Biden, the reason I think Joe Biden, even though he's a fellow Irish Catholic, I think he's going to go to hell when he dies, is because of the lies that he told about the Afghan people, particularly the Afghan National Defense Forces, that they just didn't have the will to fight. They just ran away. You know, they have to fight for their own country and they weren't willing to. Why should we? 60,000 dead Afghans. Are you kidding me? In uniform. They are not willing to fight for their country. And then for the last 18 months, the country that you are asking them to fight for is some strange American engineered coup, actually. Thank you very much, Donald Trump. The kind of hybrid weird thing where the Taliban would be telling Ashraf Ghani what to do or something. I'm gonna fight and die for that after all this time. That's another reason why it was easy for the Taliban to take over. It was easy too, because they didn't defeat the Americans. They didn't defeat NATO. The Americans surrendered to them. How difficult is that? So, yeah. As I say, I got to watch myself because I get pretty angry about what happened there.
Are there any other questions? Oh, another question up there.
Hi, I often hear the argument that most, if not all, global conflicts are caused by NATO expansionism. Do you believe NATO is a malicious organization or not?
Do you really often hear that argument?
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
You need to keep a better class of company. No, this is like UFOs, okay? There's no, what NATO expansion? NATO is a defensive organization of these tiny countries in the periphery of the Soviet Union that have decided to join NATO in the last few years because they're afraid of getting the living daylights kicked out of them. Have you looked at a map of Russia, perhaps? Show me how NATO is encircling that country. You know, Russia is like this. And NATO's kind of a few NATO countries down there. I really don't know. This is part of the difficulty, I think. There is a strange pathology in, and a lot of it's American. It's sort of this weird kind of counterculture thing that, you know, almost imagines the Taliban as a kind of a, you know, Islamic Viet Cong or something. I mean, part of it is also the language that we use. There's a guy, an Australian military strategic type guy that the Pentagon didn't pay enough attention to, David Kilcullen, who pointed out, and Stanley McChrystal figured this out too late, but they got rid of Stanley McChrystal, Yanks, unfortunately, because he was running a Maoist, basically a Maoist operation. Never take so much as a needle and thread from the people. If you drive through a village and you knock a couple of pomegranates off a tree, you stop, and you pick them up and you apologize and you say, who do I pay? Who do I compensate? And Kilcullen's view was that we actually had things backwards, that, and I'm persuaded by this, that it was actually the Democrats and the women particularly, and the students in Afghanistan, that was the that was the insurgency. That was the insurgency. The democracy was the insurgency. And the Taliban was the counterinsurgency, was the old order, the patriarchy, the theocratic fascists that had strangled so much of the life out of that country and had still its hands around the throats of a great many Pashtun people and had the sponsorship and the support of the Pakistanis. That's the establishment. And they were running a counterinsurgency against the women of Afghanistan and the Democrats. And the only militias that those women and Democrats had in the early days was the 82nd Airborne. And some lovely people from the Canadian Forces, 158 of whom were killed there. So no, I don't think the problem is NATO.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'd like to thank TerryGlavin for coming and spending time with us and for helping us understand a very complex issue in Afghanistan. So I'd like to thank the audience members. I'd like to thank the Zoom members who came and spent time with us. And of course, thank you again. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.